For the past 2 years, I've been working as a mortician at a funeral home in the small town of Clearwater, Pennsylvania. I actually love it here. I listen to lots of audiobooks, my boss is great, and I don't mind the company of the dead. They're quiet and they're not trying to sell me something, which is a lot more than I can say for most of the living. I also feel like preparing the bodies for burial is an act of respect. A service to the community is something that gives my life meaning. Without a doubt, working here was the best job that I had ever had, until we started getting the smiling corpses. I don't know when it started exactly. 3 weeks ago, I think, although time has been passing strangely since it all began. When it started, of course, not all the bodies were smiling. It was 1 or 2 of them. But then we started getting more and more of them, and everything began to spiral out of control. To be clear, yes, I know that sometimes the deceased appear to be smiling slightly. Sometimes their facial features are built that way, sort of a resting, happy face. Sometimes we even turn their lips up a little, to make their faces seem more familiar, more alive, instead of the cold mask of death. But these bodies weren't smiling slightly. No, they were full-on grins, stretching dead skin to the corners of their mouths. They were grotesque. The first one came on a cold, rainy day. Her name was Amber Reese and she was 31 years old, much younger than the bodies that I usually worked with. She had died of a sudden blood clot. As much as I liked my job, I hated dealing with the younger ones. Before I even unzipped the body bag, I was imagining the small children that she may have left behind, the aging parents grieving their daughter, the friends and family mourning a life gone too soon. I extinguished the thoughts and got to work. I turned on the light, rolled the steel bed a little closer to me, and reached for the body bag zipper. But when I unzipped her, I froze. She was smiling. Her lips were pressed tightly together, covering her teeth and the corners of her mouth sharply curved upwards. An expression like that wouldn't just require you to move your facial muscles. It would require you to hold them like that. I quickly unzipped the rest of the bag, but she was definitely dead. Her skin was as white as marble. Her eyes were closed and her lips were blue. Oh, what the hell? Maybe she was somehow alive. With my hand shaking, I gently touched her lips and then her cheeks. Her skin was so cold. I reached into the body bag and pulled out her bony wrist, checking for a pulse. There wasn't any. Now, if I weren't a mortician, I'd be thinking, no big deal, she died smiling and rigor mortis set in. But I knew that that was impossible. Rigor mortis takes hours. If she had died smiling, her face would naturally relax into a neutral setting before everything went stiff. I stood there, my head spinning. There was no way she was alive. But there was no way she could be grinning like this, dead. Not knowing what else to do, I called my boss in. He looked just as confused as I was. Maybe she had some sort of deformity, and this is her natural expression. I don't think so. The next theory was that the coroner was doing it before the bodies got to us. Maybe it was a prank, or maybe he thought that he was helping us, making the bodies look a little less dead. He was a bit odd, so it wasn't out of the question. But even if he made them smile, the smile would fade before they got here, I pointed out. That kind of smile with her lips covering her teeth like that, it requires the muscles to stay flexed. Alan didn't know what to say to that, and so he excused himself to call the coroner. When he came back, his expression was grim. Jack said that she wasn't smiling when he was doing the autopsy. Dread flooded me like somebody had just dumped a bucket of ice water over me. So the smile happened after she had died. On the drive over from the coroner. That's impossible, I said, my voice wavering. I know. Who else had access to the body? He shook his head. No one should have had access to the body except us, the coroner, and the drivers who delivered her. Well, shit. We made a few more phone calls to police officers, medical examiners, even a few EMTs, but nobody knew what we were talking about, and the body had been securely locked away after the autopsy, according to the coroner. It looked like nobody had tampered with the body, so maybe it was just something about Amber, something congenital, some sort of disease or something, that her mouth had turned up in a smile several hours after death. I knew it made no sense, but what else was I supposed to tell myself? That some demon had possessed her dead body and made it smile, that a ghost was holding up the corners of her mouth. Nothing made sense. What should I do with her? I asked Alan. Set her features like normal, I guess. Call me back if there's anything else weird. And then he turned on his heel and walked away. So that's what I did. After pacing the room a few times to calm myself down, I walked back over to the body. I positioned my index and middle fingers over the corners of her mouth, and in one swift motion I pushed down. Something felt different. I poked and prodded her cheeks, frowning. Usually cheeks are soft, with the cheekbones and jawbones giving them structure, but her cheeks felt firm all over, like they had their own internal structure somehow. Maybe she had had work done, like fillers or Botox, I thought. I poked and prodded some more, but that only confused me further. Something just felt off about the way that her bones and facial muscles were all fitting together, just underneath the skin. I called Alan back over. Does her face feel weird to you? He poked and prodded at her face as well, frowning. Yeah, a little bit, he said finally, but not abnormally. Could be some plastic surgery. Yeah, that's what I thought. Hey, maybe that's why she's smiling. I mean, it's possible, I guess, he replied. And then he left, and I was back to setting her features all alone in the morgue. My fingers worked over her cold skin quickly, trying to get the whole thing over with as fast as possible. But the more that I worked, the more time I spent with her alone in this room, the more panicked I became. Suddenly I felt dizzy. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't get enough oxygen. My legs felt weak underneath me. I was on the verge of a panic attack. I stepped away from the body, forced myself to take a deep breath. Name 5 things you can see, I told myself. Cabinets, hand sanitizers, scissors, linens, and Amber Reese's dead body. This grounding technique wasn't quite as effective when I was in the morgue room. I had never had a panic attack here before. The bodies had never bothered me like this. I was always able to disassociate it from the person who lived in it. I was always able to convince myself it was just a dead flesh, just something left behind. No different than the strands of hair and dead skin that we leave behind when we're alive. But this time it was different. The grotesque grin, pushing my fingers hard into her flesh, forcing her mouth to turn down. Something deep inside of me snapped. I took a few more minutes to collect myself, taking in deep and calming breaths, and then I forced myself to continue working. I walked over to the cabinet, got out the clear thread, and started to sew her mouth shut. You had to do this, otherwise their mouth would loll open and look weird. I had forgotten to do it once, and it was the only time that Alan yelled at me. But as I worked on the stitches, I couldn't stop picturing Amber's grin, and I felt like there was more resistance from her lips than there should have been. Or was I imagining it? The needle slipped against my fingers, but I forced myself to keep going, even though my heartbeat was ratcheting up again. I ran a comb through her dyed blonde hair, arranging it with my hands. I swirled a brush into pressed powder and swept it across her cheeks, her forehead, and her nose. I chose a nice, natural peach-colored lipstick and applied it to her lips. And then I was done. I put the final touches on her face, poking and prodding here and there, and then it was over. I stepped back and gave her a final look. Honestly, I had done a pretty good job. Her expression was perfectly peaceful. She almost looked like she was asleep. And then I left the room to grab the pair of earrings that the family had left for her. As soon as I put them in, I'd be done, and I would never have to look at this woman ever again. I grabbed them from the office and then hurried back to the morgue. I froze. Amber Reese was smiling again. "Alan?" I shouted. "Alan!" The floor spun underneath me. I heard Alan's footsteps behind me quickly approaching. I was losing my balance. I stumbled over to the wall and leaned against it, trying not to fall. "I set her features," I told him. "I stitched her mouth shut, and she's grinning again." Alan stood there frozen, his mouth hanging open, his brown skin ashen. Without a word, he walked into the room, looking over to her. For several seconds, he didn't say anything. "I've never seen anything like this," he said finally. I joined him at her side, looked down at her awful smiling face. I noticed one of the stitches had snapped. A piece of clear thread trailed out of her mouth. It couldn't be Ben playing with us, could it?" I asked. I wished it was. With all my being, I wished that this was some ridiculous prank, and not the body moving on its own. Ben was the other mortician. He was considerably younger than me and Alan, only 21, and heavily influenced by social media. He was always filming something or talking about some sort of TikTok challenge that he had done. It was nauseating. "I don't think so. He's supposed to be getting Mr. Vanderbilt ready, but we can check the security footage." Alan had installed security cameras in every room of the funeral home after someone had broken in over the summer. I followed him down the hallway, feeling a little bit better with each step that I put between myself and Amber Reese. He sat down at the desk and pulled up the security footage. I held my breath as he hit play. I watched the screen as I worked on Amber's body and the grainy and black and white footage. I watched as I left to get the earrings. The door swung shut. 1 second passed, 2, and then it happened. The corners of Amber's mouth yanked up. It was like they were attached to a fishing line that had suddenly been pulled taut. "What the hell?" Alan said. That can't happen, can it?" I asked, my voice shaking. "No, there's no way that can happen." Dead bodies move after death on occasion. Twitching is common, caused by the release of chemicals left over in nerve endings. Decomposition can also make the body move. I had read an article about a man whose arms had stretched straight out at his sides weeks after death because of decomposition. But this wasn't decomposition, because she had been presumably stored properly since her death. And this wasn't a random twitch either. It was a grin. I had read somewhere in some inspirational article somewhere that it only took 12 muscles to smile, and many more to frown. That meant that all 12 of Amber Reese's facial muscles were working in concert, making and holding a smile. It made no sense. Alan rewound the footage, playing the footage over and over again, muttering to himself about rigor mortis and other medical jargon. But I couldn't sit there and keep watching it. Each time that I saw that grin yank up again, I felt like I might vomit. I left the office and hurried back to the morgue. I wanted Amber Reese gone, and she would be tomorrow morning when we drove her to the cemetery. Whatever this all was, it would be gone and over with by 11 a.m. tomorrow. All I had to do was set her face again, load her into one of the refrigerated cabinets, and my job was done. When I opened the door, I found Ben standing over Amber's corpse. "Whoa," he said as I walked in. "What did you do to this one?" "Nothing. She came like that." "Seriously? What's wrong with her?" "Well, nothing to my knowledge." "But she's smiling." "I know." He glanced back at me, obviously confused. "I don't know what's going on, okay, and neither does Alan. She looks like she's grinning, and when I said her face, she went back to grinning. Her face just does that, and we don't know why." "She looks really creepy," he said with a grin. And then I saw his hand twitch towards his pocket, towards his phone. "Don't even think about taking a picture," I snapped at him. I guess to Ben, the allure of making a viral TikTok outweighed the chances of ruining his entire career. Ben laughed, looking dejected. "Idiot." As soon as he was gone, I forced myself to re-sew her mouth shut, and then I pushed the corners of her mouth down hard until she looked like she was frowning. Maybe that was my problem. Last time, maybe I needed to set her features in the complete opposite direction. I'm sure the family would be pissed to see her frowning at the funeral, but I didn't care. And then I slid her into the cabinet. As soon as the door shut, relief flooded over me. It's all over, I'm done. Little did I know that Amber Reese was just the beginning. The next week, we got more smiling corpses. Jasmine Thomas, 47, pronounced dead at the scene of a car accident. Eleanor Wu, 62, dead after a long battle with pancreatic cancer. John Ivanov, 23, dead from a mugging gone wrong. All smiling. Alan and I called the police, the coroner, the delivery people, but nobody reported seeing the bodies smiling. There were police reports too from the car accident and the mugging, but none of those mentioned a smile. It seems certain all the bodies had started smiling after they had died, which didn't make a lick of sense. Alan started calling colleagues of his, even professors at the local college, but none of them knew. He started floating various theories, and maybe the coroner was using contaminated tools or substances that the body was having a post-mortem allergic reaction to. Maybe they were being stored at a slight incline, and that was moving the facial muscles. Of course, this didn't explain why the bodies started smiling again even after we had set their features, but we were grasping at straws. No one had a possible explanation for what was going on. I pondered all of this as I pulled on my rubber gloves and started working on John Ivanov. I stared down at John's pale face, his stubble-lined lips twisted into a smile. The grin somehow looked even more grotesque on his young face. I worked on autopilot. I yanked the corners of his mouth down into a deep frown, and then I grabbed the clear thread and, steadying my shaking hands, plunged the needle into his lips. I used double the number of stitches. Maybe that would stop the smile from reappearing. Because despite all my work on Amber Reese's face, her smile had reappeared. We had gotten an irate call from her sister at the funeral. "Hey Sam, can you come here for a second?" Ben asked from the other side of the morgue. Sure." I followed him over. He had been working on another smiling body, an older woman in her 50s or 60s. I didn't remember her name, as Ben had been in charge of her. "Her file says that she was 160 pounds when she died," he said, "but she feels really light to me." I grabbed her by the shoulders and shifted around the table a little. "Huh, yeah," I replied. "She does feel a little bit light." I grabbed her by her midsection and shook her a little more. Ben was right. If I wasn't looking right at her, I would have guessed this woman was no more than 100 pounds. "Let's weigh her again," I said. Maybe the coroner entered the wrong weight. And so we rolled her onto the scale. When the number came up, my heart dropped. 97 pounds. There's no way this woman is 97 pounds, I said. I know. I stared down at her, slightly taller than average with an average physique. She'd have to be rail thin to be 97 pounds, if she could even get to that weight at all. Ben told me that he would discuss it with Alan and then continued preparing her for burial. I went back to working on John. I tried to not even look at his face, just focusing on getting him ready, like it was as mundane as sweeping the floor or folding clothes. But then, as my hands worked, I had a moment of clarity. 5 smiling corpses had come in now. If it were just one or even maybe 2, it could be explained away as an allergic reaction or a deformity, or whatever Alan's theory of the day was. But 5? When as far as we knew this had never happened before. There was really only one explanation that suddenly hit me like a ton of bricks. Something was infecting them. Maybe some sort of parasite or a bacteria. Maybe it's in the town's water supply. I suddenly had the mental image of a pale, leech-like creature slithering around in John's mouth, stretching his lips into that hideous smile. And then something even worse occurred to me. If I touched their faces, was I now infected? Panic set in. My mouth felt itchy or stiff or something. I left John on the table and I ran to the bathroom. I washed my hands over and over again. Of course, if it were infectious, it was probably too late, but I had to do something. Of course, when I got back to the morgue, John was grinning again. The stitches had snapped and a single drop of blood coated his lips. Oh shit. I stared down at him, my entire world tunneling down into a single focal point. His mouth. I had to look inside his mouth and make sure that there weren't any squiggling, writhing leeches in there. Holding my breath, I pushed my fingers into his mouth and yanked his jaw open. No. For a split second, I thought that I saw a flicker of movement in the darkness of his throat. I grabbed my phone and turned the flashlight on. Hand shaking, I lifted it over his mouth and peered in. Nothing was there. I shone the flashlight all around, even lifting his lips to look at his gums and teeth, but I didn't see anything. I let out the breath that I had been holding. Get a grip. I closed his mouth, and then I forced myself to take a few deep breaths, slowly letting them out. Everything's fine. Stop scaring yourself. Calm down. I re-sewed his mouth shut, even though I knew that it was probably futile. My entire body was shaking with tension and I needed something to keep busy. As I worked though, I noticed something else odd. Hadn't John died and a mugging gone wrong? Hadn't he been stabbed? Yet his pale skin was as perfect as porcelain. No purple bruises, no stab wounds as far as I could see. Then again, he was dressed. Ben had done that earlier. So it was very possible that all those wounds were covered up by clothing. Still, I had dealt with a few victims of muggings and other violent crimes in my career, and none of them looked as pristine as John did even when fully dressed. Other than looking deathly blue, he looked as if he were in perfect health, only sleeping. I shuddered and I loaded him into the cabinet, desperate not to look at him anymore. A few days later, we got a visit from the sheriff. He sat with us in Alan's office, arms crossed, giving each of us an icy glare. "I'm going to have to ask you to stop investigating this," he told us plainly. "What? Why?" Alan asked. "It's attracting too much attention," Sheriff Thompson replied. "I got a call from WBX the other day, and they want to do a story on it, asking all kinds of questions. We don't want people, outsiders, poking around in our business, you know." "With all due respect," Alan replied, "it seems like this kind of thing has never been documented before. One of the professors at Hawthorne wants to." "No." Sheriff Thompson replied, cutting him off. "We don't want any studies conducted, nothing of the sort, okay?" "You can't make us stop," Alan told him. "I can't," he agreed. "But let me ask you this, Alan. Do you like lawsuits? Because if there's a news story on WBX about smiling corpses, you better believe the families affected are going to be looking for someone to blame. And that someone is going to be you." A heavy silence filled the room. Alan averted his eyes. "Understood," he finally muttered quietly. "Good." And with that, the sheriff was gone. Alan cooled it on the investigation after that. I could tell that it really bothered him, but the Moynier funeral home was his pride and joy. He had bought it from the Moyniers several years back, and he had turned it from a small operation to one of the biggest funeral homes in the county. He didn't want a scandal or lawsuits more than anyone, so we shut up. We continued to receive more smiling corpses. We stayed quiet about it though. Alan ordered some sort of industrial strength adhesive, and when we used that on the lips instead of the thread, it seemed that the smiles didn't come back. And so for weeks, that's how we dealt with one of the most horrific things to happen in Clearwater, Pennsylvania. We glued a corpse's mouth shut. 3 weeks had passed since the first corpse had arrived. We had received a total of 27 so far. Alan had stopped investigating and just continued buying more and more of the adhesive by the gallon jug. But I was getting really concerned at this point, so I continued to investigate on my own. Untraceable, anonymous stuff, so that Alan wouldn't be getting mad at me. Internet sleuthing and the like. All my investigations into their deaths came up as dead ends, and so I turned to their lives. There didn't seem to be a common thread. However, the smiling victims were of every age, gender, occupation, ethnicity, and religion. They seemed to have absolutely nothing in common. Until I looked up their addresses. All the victims lived within a square mile of each other. I printed out a map of Clearwater and in red pen made a little dot where each of the smiling ones had lived. They formed a cluster on the west side of town, with several of them coming from the same street, Highview Lane, the street bordering the woods of the state park. I uncapped the red pen and wrote the date above each dot. Not necessarily their death date, but the date that we had received the body from our internal records. And that's when I came to a horrifying conclusion. The first several bodies, including Amber's, had come from Highview Lane. The next bunch had come from the streets surrounding it. The most recent ones, however, had come from the areas furthest from that street. In other words, it was spreading. The nexus was Highview Lane, with the smiling corpses spreading outwards towards the rest of the town, like some sort of virus. What the hell? The 3 most recent ones had come from only a half-mile away from the funeral home. I explained all of this to Alan in his office, in an ear whisper with the doors closed. "It's spreading," I said, pointing to the map. "You're not supposed to be looking into this," he said angrily, although I had a feeling that his anger was more about Sheriff Thompson than me. "Look, I'm sorry, okay? But now that I know this, we have to do something." "Do what exactly? Tell the police? Like Sheriff Thompson would actually help us," he scoffed. "And it doesn't seem like it's actually harming anyone. Clearly it's not killing people because all of them had a legitimate cause of death. Like a lot of the smiling bodies, they're from people who had died of cancer. So what? The thing is causing cancer. I don't know, but this isn't a coincidence." Alan buried his face in his hands and let out a groan. "If we tell everyone, there's gonna be a panic, and I might go out of business." "So what, we just keep it a secret?" I asked. "I don't know, I honestly don't. I've never come across anything like this." He let out a sigh. Just give me some time to think about it, okay? A few days. We'll figure something out. I left his office disturbed. Alan always did the right thing, even when it meant that his business was suffering. I remember last year our car had gotten into an accident while transporting a body and it had gotten a little damaged. He could have easily said the bump on her head was there when the body had arrived, or tried to cover it with her hair and hope that they didn't notice. But he had told them the truth, that we didn't package the body correctly and that there was an accident. We lost half of the funeral expenses, but Alan believed in doing the right thing. Or so I thought. We just couldn't keep this a secret. Something awful was happening here and it was spreading. And so I decided to take matters into my own hands. I drove down to that area of town myself to see if there was anything that I could figure out. I wouldn't get out of the car in case there was something in the air. A virus, a pathogen, fungal spores. But I would drive around and see if anything struck me. Highview Lane was within a wealthy neighborhood, a development of McMansions that had been built last year. I kept the heat off, not to let any sort of pathogen into the car, and I continued driving. It was only 9 o'clock, but everything appeared closed. Neon signs for gas stations and convenience stores, glowing brightly in the darkness. Everything was still, silent. And then I drove up the hill and turned onto Highview Lane. I stared up at the houses. They were so sterile and harsh looking, white with trim and gutters painted black. The wood between the window panes was painted black too, making the house look more like a prison than a home. I'm not sure whether it was the wealth of the place or some sort of sixth sense, an instinctual feeling, but I felt unwelcome, like I was trespassing, like everyone in these houses was watching me, watching the beat-up sedans scutter along their pristine streets. I need to get out of here now. I could turn around in a driveway, but I felt like that could provoke someone. My headlights would be shining right in their windows. The cul-de-sac was only about 10 yards ahead of me, anyway. When I got to the cul-de-sac, however, I froze. There were no houses here. Instead, the entire area had been cordoned off with chain-link fences. A sign hung from the metal reading in big red letters, "Keep out." I rolled the car forward to get a better look. The site had clearly been prepared for building. Sure, the grass was long, but there weren't any trees, and the area was unnaturally flat. Within the fenced-in area, I saw 2 large rectangular holes. The basements had been dug out already, the foundations ready to be poured, but the developer had abandoned them. Why? This development had been in high demand. I had driven past this area of town while they were building it, and the starting price of the homes had shot up more than 50% between breaking ground and finishing the last house. So if the demand was there and there was money to be made, why did they just stop? Maybe they found something, I thought. Maybe they dug up something. Maybe they dug up a parasite or a virus or some other kind of pathogen. I had read that climate change was causing ice to melt in the Arctic, and it was releasing pathogens. Wasn't there some outbreak of something in Siberia several years back? Who was to say that there weren't pathogens under the ground too, laying in wait, dormant until somebody dug them up? I desperately wanted to get out of the car and take a closer look, but I knew that would be a really bad idea. And so I inched the car forward until my tires bumped the curb, and then I flicked down the high beams. I froze. The dirt wall of the left hole looked disturbed. The soil was rough and dark rather than smooth and crusted over. Just an animal, I told myself. Probably a raccoon or something that fell down there and was scrambling to get out. Even though I told myself that, I hit the gas and sped home as fast as I could. It took me many hours of internet sleuthing to find out any information, but I finally did. A few random posts on local websites claimed the building sites had been abandoned because the soil had too much clay in it, or the rock underneath wasn't structurally sound. But there was one post on a local forum last year that I would have easily dismissed as a conspiracy theory if I hadn't been dealing with smiling dead bodies on a day-to-day basis. Did you know they found this really weird dead animal where they're building those big houses by Johnson Park? My husband's cousin works on the construction team. He said when they were excavating, they found this dead animal, except it looked like nothing that he had ever seen. A really long, thin body and bluish-white skin like a cave creature or something. Like our very own Montauk monster. I stared at the computer screen stunned. That was it. That thing must have died from whatever the pathogen was, and when it was dug up, it infected someone. Patient 0. I told Alan everything that I found. Unfortunately, he seemed to take me less seriously than before, his eyebrows raising higher and higher as I told him everything. So, you think the construction workers dug up this monster, and then it spread some disease to them somehow? Yeah. Did any of the construction workers die? I frowned. She didn't say anything about it, but like you said, the pathogen doesn't kill people. Yeah, but wasn't this last year? We would have been getting smiling bodies for months and then, if what you're saying is true. I think they only broke ground on the last 2 houses recently. Besides, maybe it has a dormant phase or something. Alan sighed. I mean, I suppose everything you're saying could be true, but it sounds extremely far-fetched. I know. I'll think on it, I promise. This time his tone sounded more sincere. But right now, we've got to get back into work. A few bodies arrived today and one of them is smiling, so good luck with that. I bought new adhesive, by the way, extra strength. I got the message that this was the end of the conversation loud and clear. Reluctantly, I walked out of his office and headed back to the morgue. Ben was already in there, working on something else. He glanced up at me and grinned. Left the smiling one for you, he said. Oh, great, thanks, I replied, rolling my eyes. This day was just getting worse and worse by the minute. As I flipped through the man's files, however, I felt a rush of relief. He's supposed to be cremated, I told Ben. Oh, cool, I rolled my eyes. Ben loved the cremator. For some reason, not many people in Clearwater chose to be cremated. Whenever one did, Ben got excited. What is it with some people in fire? We rolled the body down to the cremator and got the man inside. The door clanked shut and Ben adjusted the settings and then looked at me. I gave him a thumbs up. He pulled the lever. The flames whooshed on. And then we heard it. A faint, high-pitched screech joined the pops and crackles of the fire, almost like the shrill sound of a whistle except more human. Ben and I looked at each other, eyes wide. What is that? I asked. Should I turn it off? Ben replied, his face white. I nodded. He yanked the lever down, but it was too late. The remains had already been reduced to lumps of charred ash. There's no chance that he was actually alive, right? Ben asked. No. For the first time, he looked utterly panicked. So even though I wasn't particularly fond of Ben, I gently led him back to the morgue and showed him the records. The man had died several days ago and had been stored in a refrigerated cabinet. There was no way that he could still be alive. With Ben relieved, he excused himself for an early lunch break. I sat there alone in the morgue, phone in hand, swiveling gently in the chair. Something was bothering me, though I didn't want to tell Ben. First, even if the man was dead, there could still be a parasite alive inside him. Could things like leeches and tapeworms make noise? A quick search told me yes. There was a 3-centimeter marine worm that lived off the coast of Japan, for example, that could make loud popping sounds. Ew. But there was something else bothering me too. We usually leave the bodies in the cremator for 2 to 3 hours, because while the soft tissue gets reduced to ash pretty fast, the bones take hours to fully carbonize. The remains that we pulled out should have been a skeleton. Instead, they were just a pile of ash. How did an entire skeleton burn up so fast? I spent the rest of the day sneaking away on my phone researching, but everything seemed to reach a dead end. I raked through the entire 10-page forum thread where the woman had talked about the body found at the construction site, but my faith in her story started to flag. On page 3, she linked to her blog post, which was filled with obnoxious ads and talks about aliens. She claimed that they had found metal scraps at the construction site too, burned and twisted. Our very own Roswell incident. I sighed, shaking my head. I then did a ton of searches whether certain pathogens or parasites could alter bone density. The whole thing about the skeleton not burning up seemed like the only fact that I could cling to. It wasn't a gray area, it was black and white. The bones burned up when they shouldn't have. That didn't come up with much though. Most parasites were uninterested in bones. I got out a piece of paper and wrote down everything that I knew so far. The convergence of cases on Highview Lane, the weird construction site, the smiling bodies which had other abnormalities, not bruising, weighing less than they should and burning up faster. After that, I wrote down everyone involved. The police, Sheriff Thompson, the coroner Jack, the delivery companies, and the 3 of us, Alan, Ben, and me. Several more searches only produced one interesting fact. That was probably more of a coincidence than anything else. The man who led one of the delivery companies was named Elias. The guy who worked on the construction site at Highview Lane mentioned in the forum post was also named Elias. A spark of an idea lit within me. Could Elias be patient zero? Hard at work, I see, Alan said when he found me sitting in the morgue staring at my phone. Oh, sorry, I said hastily. Just taking a quick break. He didn't look happy. Well, it was true that I had spent a good part of the workday on my phone. Sorry, I said again. No, it's fine. Listen, we have a delivery on the way, but I gotta get heading home. Jay's got a fever and stuff. Can you stay? I guess so. Did Ben already leave? Yeah, he got out 10 minutes early, Alan said with a sigh. Anyway, they should be here by 6. If they're not, you can leave then. And if they're mad that they have to take the body back to the coroner, then that's their problem. I think the power is out in a few places, though. There was some bad thunder earlier. Yeah, well, another sigh. Anyway, I'll lock up and everything. All you need to worry about is getting the body in. I'll pay you overtime, of course, too. Sounds good. Alan left, and then it was just me, alone in the funeral home. Great. I sat by the window waiting, watching the rain pound on the glass. The street and sidewalk glistened red, reflecting the myriad of taillights from all the braking cars. I saw a couple hurry past, angling their umbrella in front of them to try and block the rain. As the woman glanced up at her sign, she scrunched her face in disgust. We usually didn't get pedestrians here, even though we were just off Main Street. People didn't like being reminded of their own mortality. And then the delivery arrived. A sleek, dark van rolling into the driveway. My heart pounded as I realized the text on the door read, Everson Delivery Services. That was the delivery company that Elias ran. I hurried downstairs. The funeral home is on a hill and the back door is on the basement level with the morgue. Alan thought that it was so convenient, but I thought it was a nuisance, going up and down the stairs all the time. When I finally got to the back door, the two men were already rolling the body out of the back. "Hey, thanks for waiting," the shorter one said, smiling at me. "Hey, can I ask you something? You work for Elias, right?" His smile instantly dropped. We've been getting some bodies that have been smiling." I continued in a hushed tone. "Have you seen them?" "Nope, I haven't seen anything like that," the taller man replied, shaking his head. "Do you happen to have Elias's phone number by any chance?" The two men traded a look. "Sorry, can't do that," the shorter one said. "Why not?" "He's a very private person," the taller one said, rolling the cart down the ramp. "But, here you go," he said, cutting me off. And then the two men hurried back into the van. They quickly pulled out, sloshing rain everywhere, leaving me alone with the body. Well, that was weird. Really weird. Usually the people handling the delivery always roll the body into the morgue for us. Common courtesy in the funeral home world. But I had spooked them with my questions about Elias. They didn't want me to know anything about him. I'm onto something. I rolled the body down the hallway myself, the metal wheels clattering against the floor. I made a sharp right into the morgue and then called Alan to let him know. Before loading the body into the cabinet, I always did a quick check. Sometimes they got a little jostled in transit, and I wouldn't want to store the body with their face tilted to the side, for example. I unzipped the body bag. No, I recognized her. Mildred Hastings, the old woman that lived 2 floors down from me. I saw her all the time. She had a little yippy dog that she would walk all the time. She would talk to me when I got my mail. She even invited me over for tea one time when I was locked out of my apartment. Mildred was dead, and she was smiling. The same smile that all of them had. Except this time, it was twisting features that were familiar to me, a face that I knew. The floor spun underneath me. I leaned against the cabinet and held myself steady, a wave of nausea rolling through me. I forced my breathing to slow. In, out, in, out. I needed to calm down. All I needed to do was zip her up, get her in the cabinet, and leave. That's all that I had to do. Then I would be on my way home to snuggling up in a blanket and watching TV. The phone rang. I jumped about a foot in the air, swearing. I stumbled out of the morgue and into Alan's office. The shrill sound of the ringing pierced the silence. "I'm coming," I muttered under my breath, my legs wobbly beneath me. I picked it up on the third ring. "Hello?" "Is this Moyner Funeral Home?" the voice on the other end of the line asked. "Yes." "Hi, this is Dan with Meadow Services. I'm calling to schedule the delivery of Mildred Hastings." I frowned. "What do you mean, schedule it? She was delivered a few minutes ago." A pause. "That's not possible." A creeping dread trickled down my back. "What do you mean?" "We have her body right here. We didn't make the delivery today because of the storm." My heart plummeted to the floor. What the hell? "No, there must be a mistake. We just got her. She's in the morgue right now." "Maybe you're getting her confused with another delivery." "No, this was the only delivery that we were waiting for." My body went cold, my head spun. "Can you just tell me if tomorrow afternoon is okay, ma'am?" the voice said on the other line. "Yeah, it's fine," I told him, and then I hung up the phone. Black dots danced in my vision. I sat down in Alan's chair before I had the chance to faint. It didn't make sense. It was her body. Unless... The realization came crashing down on me. John Ivanov, the mugging victim with no bruises, the woman who weighed 97 pounds, the man's bones that burned up too fast in the crematory, and the smiles that kept reappearing over and over. What if the bodies weren't the real bodies of the deceased? What if someone somewhere along the chain was trading out all the corpses for different ones, clones, replicas, ones that were smiling, that kept smiling no matter how many times we set their features? I pulled up our records and typed in a few names of smiling bodies that I remembered, like John Ivanov and Jasmine Thomas. My heart dropped when I saw that all of them came from Everson Delivery Services. I ran out of the office, heart pounding in my ears. I ran into the morgue and I froze. Mildred's body was gone. The body bag was zipped all the way down, and it was empty. No, no, no. I ran over, hardly believing it. I unzipped the bag all the way and pressed my hands inside, as if a 180-pound woman could be hiding somewhere inside it. It was completely and totally empty. Every fiber of me was screaming, get out now." I turned on my heel and I ran down the hallway, sprinting towards the back door. I stopped dead in my tracks. Standing in the dark hallway, silhouetted by the glass door behind her, was the naked figure of Mildred Hastings. She stood perfectly still. Her dark eyes glinted. Her white hair fell in messy, scraggly curls over her face. Her skin hung loose on her body, her bare feet sticking to the linoleum floor beneath her. And she was smiling that horrible stretched grin. I whipped around and ran. Thunder rumbled behind me, rattling the glass. I took the stairs, two at a time, my entire body shaking. I burst onto the first floor, ran to the front door, twisted the knob. No, Alan had locked up when he left. That included locking the front door with the deadbolt that only he had the key to. For a split second, I thought about going back downstairs, but then I heard it. Mildred's footsteps coming up the stairs. What do? The footsteps got louder. I ran down the hallway and wrenched at one of the windows, but I was 2 stories up. The fall could kill me, especially since it wasn't grass beneath but hard pavement. I swallowed. I have to hide. I have to. Creak. Mildred had made it to the top of the stairs. I shot out of the hallway and into the nearest room, the showroom. About a dozen caskets and coffins stood before me of every shape and size. They glinted in the dim light, polished to perfection, alongside arrangements of fake flowers and easels displaying portraits of random people. I picked one at random, a heavy mahogany casket engraved with a cross, and I climbed in. And then I pulled the heavy lid back over me, lowering it as gently as I could so that it wouldn't thunk shut. As soon as I was in total darkness, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. "Please," I whispered, my words muffled in the soft, puffy cotton sides of the casket. "Please help me." I gave the woman on the other line the address. Then all I could do was wait. Thump. I heard Mildred's footsteps enter the room. Every muscle in my body froze. My breathing sounded incredibly loud, like it was being piped through a surround sound stereo, and so I held my breath. But even my heartbeat, the rush of blood through my veins, sounded incredibly loud, locked in this casket. Thump. "Please don't find me. Please." The footsteps were getting progressively louder. I couldn't see anything. It was pure darkness, like I was buried in the earth itself. I began to panic. Why am I hiding here? If she finds me, I have no escape. I should have hidden a doorway or under the stairs, so I could keep running, keep changing hiding spots. I always sucked at hide and seek. Thump. I held my breath, my entire body shaking. Thump. And then the footsteps stopped. She was right there. She seemed to have found the casket that I was in. I could feel the heaviness of her presence weighing down on the hot air of the casket itself, pressing down on me, smothering me. The casket lid opened. Mildred's face loomed over me. Her skin hung loosely over her skull, her dark eyes twinkled, and her lips were stretched taut into that horrible grin. And then her mouth opened. Her mouth opened wider and wider until her jaw unhinged completely. Within her throat, I could see two glittering black eyes and the pale bluish flesh of a creature who had never seen the sun. Just like the creature they found on Highview Lane, I thought dimly. The creature didn't infect people with a parasite. It is the parasite. For a second, I was paralyzed, and then I pulled my knees up to my chest and I kicked her as hard as I could. Mildred staggered back. I scrambled out of the casket, the heavy lid scraping along my back, almost pinning me down. But I made my way out, fighting for my life until I fell onto the floor. She lunged at me. My gaze caught on one of the enormous easels. I grabbed it and pointed one leg of it at her mouth. "Don't get any closer," I shouted. Of course, the creature in there didn't understand. As soon as Mildred took a jerky, stumbling step forward, I thrust the leg into her open mouth. An inhuman screech filled the room. I dropped the easel and I ran down the stairs. I made it to the back door and I burst through it, out into the storm. A torrent of rain fell onto me, soaking me. Thunder rumbled in the distance, cut with the sound of distant sirens. I stumbled towards the road, glancing back a final time. Mildred wasn't following. When the police broke into the building, they found Mildred's eviscerated body. It appeared to have just been a shell, completely hollowed out on the inside. As for the creature that was living inside of her, there was no sign of it, or so they said. Sometimes I wonder if they actually captured it and took it off to some secret government compound for examination. Everson Delivery Services probably went out of business. Elias Everson skipped town and disappeared off the map completely. I wonder if he's really Elias at all, or if he's simply a meat suit, a shell, controlled by one of those alien creatures. Because a few weeks later I read an article about a missing woman showing up at her husband's doorstep, alive and well. The husband was reporting strange behavior, and I wondered if she too was just a shell. Maybe real human bodies are too full of bones and organs and blood to inhabit, so they built a replica based on the corpses of those who have died. Speaking of the bodies, the police never found where all the real dead bodies went, and the other 30 smiling corpses were sent to a lab for examination. The ones that had already been buried were exhumed. Sheriff Thompson told us that it was a parasite, something in the water highly contagious. Areas of clear water were cordoned off for decontamination. Highview Lane was evacuated. But I know the truth. Because Alan and I kept one of the smiling corpses, the family had asked that he be cremated and we gave them fake ashes instead. I know that's a horrible thing to do, except it isn't that horrible when you consider the remains weren't even his to begin with. Alan and I set the body on the table in front of us, staring at each other. "You ready?" he asked, his voice shaky. "I am," I replied. Alan sunk a scalpel into the dead man's chest. He peeled back the skin, and when I leaned forward, I almost threw up. The man had no ribs and no organs and nothing that was remarkably human. In their place was a creature with pale bluish skin folded in on itself. Hands shaking, I leaned over the man's face and pulled his mouth open. Beyond his teeth, in the darkness of his throat, I could see a pale face, eyes closed as if it were sleeping. Ellen and I gave each other a look, and then we rolled the body off to the cremator